Welcome to Season 5 of Outstanding Women Leaders, Witty and Wise Conversations. I'm your host, Katie L. Eads, founder and chief owl at Outstanding Women Leaders, professional coaching and podcast, an organization dedicated to empowering women in leadership, relationships, and life. Owl is on a mission to host 100 million witty and wise conversations that inspire you, disrupt the way leaders think, and stir your soul into aligned action. That inspiration begins with a set of rules to guide our conversation today. Rule number 1, nobody gets to be wrong. Rule number 2, nobody gets to be right. And rule number 3, everybody gets to be vulnerable. My favorite rule, number 4, everything is included. We do not edit here. This conversation is exactly what it needs to be in this moment in time. We've asked our guests to join us via video to allow us to create authentic connection. Eyes are the window to the soul. You will be seen here. You will be heard. There is space for you. When this conversation comes to a close, I will ask our guests 3 questions. If you've tuned in before, you know what they are. If you haven't, you don't want to miss them. But enough about me. Today, I'm excited to welcome outstanding women leader Anika Pavel, a multi-talented writer, model, actress, and one-time James Bond girl. She is the author of the compelling new book, Encounter with the Future. Anika's unique life journey from her childhood in Iron Curtain Czechoslovakia to her rise as an international fashion model and actress, and now a writer, makes her a fascinating guest for us today. Encounter with the Future is a collection of essays that weave together her experience across continents and historical events, told with her characteristic wit and perceptiveness. Welcome, Anika. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a privilege.
There's so much to dive into, but before we do, we want to start back at the beginning. How do you become a James Bond girl, and what movie were you in?
Well, the movie I was in was Spy Who Loved Me with Roger Moore. And it evolved through my modeling and acting in London. So it's to make it very simple is you go for audition and you either get it or you don't. So, but by the time I did get this role, I already have done many other work, a lot more work in as a model and as an actress.
Mm.
Oh.
And more importantly, beyond that, you have this really complex immigrant experience, resilience. Take us back through the beginning as a child and what your experiences were.
Well, I was born in communist Czechoslovakia when Soviet Union was at its height. And so it was a very controlled power. Can you see me? Sorry.
Yes.
It was a very controlled childhood that a lot of freedom was dictated. But as a child, as a little child, you don't really feel it quite as much. It's when I became a teenager that I wanted to travel. I wanted to see, and my mother always believed in books, 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 and her famous saying was, travel is a university of life. And she wanted to learn. She believed that more we learn about the other people, the better we are. And so when the opportunity presented itself, when the Soviets were losing a little bit of a power over Czechoslovakia through Alexander Dubček, who believed in communism, socialism with a human face, i.e., he believed in a free travel, he believed in freedom of speech, and he believed in people getting their job according to their ability as opposed to who they knew. So that started to make a big difference. And I just graduated from high school, and my mother was able to get me a job in London, in Ipswich, really, as an au pair. And so I came and learned to speak English. And it's not that hard when nobody else understands Slovak. And I was thrilled. I was absorbing it all. But sadly, in August 28th, Soviets tanks came to Prague and just basically rolled out of the airplanes to Wenceslav Square. And that was the end of the Prague Spring. And I still had a visa to stay in England. So I decided I will stay until my visa ends. But by the time I also knew there was a danger that longer I stay, my coming back could be questionable. And then before my visa expired, the communist regime announced that everybody who was abroad had to come home or will be labeled a traitor. And I had two of my brothers who were at a university. So I was in a very difficult dilemma whether I was going to sacrifice my life or my family. So that was probably the hardest time of my entire life. But I did manage, and then I became I entered a competition to be international model for Daily Mail newspaper, and I was lucky enough to win. And from then on, there was still, like every model anywhere in the world, you start with working during the day as a model, and the work is very sporadic. So you work as a waitress, you take any other job that you might do, and little by little work yourself up into magazine covers and fashion shows and fashion pages and then TV shows. And that's where I ended up.
Mm,
That was a journey. That was my journey.
yeah. And how does your childhood under the Iron Curtain influence your career choices? Well, you told us a little bit about career choices and wanting to stay, but how does that influence even your worldview today? I imagine that you have a very unique perspective.
Well, as a child, and as I was growing up, I wanted to be a writer, always writer. And then when it came to making a decision, my mother said, you can't just be a writer, you have to have a job. So she encouraged me to be a journalist. So that was my hope. And so it's a difficult job to get, or even to get into university. And so she felt that if I will speak a language, if I speak English and I spend time abroad, it would give me an opening to be able to get to be a journalist. But of course, that has never materialized. And so my view was always about, learning about other people. That is the most important thing you can do. And so that's what I was hoping to do as a journalist. Um, and my view was always, I desired a freedom, like most people do, which did not really exist. You couldn't, we were dictated what we wear. We were not allowed to have makeup. We were not, it was almost impossible to get, people had to smuggle to get like a Beatles or the television was highly restricted. And so, we used to get into a Vienna television because where I come from, my town is only about 100 miles from Vienna. So people figured out how, and almost everybody spoke German. So people figured out how to get programs on Vienna television. And so, my view is live and let live, not pun intended, James Bond. But it's people should have an ability to learn and to live freely. That's, I think, is the most important human thing to do.
And so you've lived out this dream of becoming a writer and you've written Encounter with the Future. What inspired you to write that? And what are you hoping that readers take away?
Well, I have started to, at some point I gave up writing because I couldn't write in Slovak and I couldn't really write in English. But then lo and behold came a spell check and a computers, and I suddenly was able to write. And then I went to school. My children very much encouraged me. I went to school, took several courses, and I just started to write a short essays about my life and about how I got here. And then my children encouraged me to write more because they wanted to know. So my book is, there's a hardly, it's a difficult label because although people think of it as autobiography, but there's so much about my country, my people, and my family. A lot of the essays are not about me, but it's about where I come from. And I think that is, to me, that is important. And so what I wanted to achieve is for people to learn about those people who very few people know about, because it's not that different. We are not that different. Everybody faces similar problems. And then some of my essays started to get published. And so I tried to organize it in a way that it will, even they stand alone, they would make some kind of a sense. And so it kind of is labeled either biography or it's labeled memoir, but it's more a history of a little country and its people and one person who got away.
Can you share a particularly impactful essay from the book and the story behind it? We'd love to hear a little glimpse of what we can see in there.
Well, I think that the ones which might be very appropriate at this point is an essay I wrote about what happened with my brother who spoke, who was a teacher of English in Slovakia. And he desperately wanted to come to England. And we managed to get him out. And then he worked for the BBC award service, which of course the communists did not like because all of the newspapers were controlled by the government. And so you only got to read what they wanted you to read. Where places like Radio Free Europe, BBC, Voice of America, we were able to get that and we got a news. So my brother was hit by a car coming home. And we have learned later that there was a connection to the arm of the KGB in London. But my brother, whom I have obviously was worried about, and I tried to encourage him to take a different job. And he said to me, that's exactly what they want. And he went back and he worked at the BBC, and eventually he came to America and he was working for Voice of America. So he never stopped telling people the truth, which is so important.
That is
Truth matters.
Yeah, it's very inspiring and a very relevant, I think, in today's world when we talk about what is truth and what is.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm also curious, so tell us about how you got to the United States. You're currently in the United States as well. Yes.
Well, that was kind of easier because I married a Bostonian. That's why I'm on Cape Cod.
That makes sense.
So yes, so that made sense. So we got married in London. He was working in London as a international lawyer, and so then he started a company, and we went to Hong Kong, and where I still continue to work as a model because I did several commercials in Hong Kong from London before I got married. And so I had some contacts and I continued to work in Hong Kong. But then when my second child was born, I stopped. And when we came to New Jersey, I went back to try to work with my daughter in New York. And we did work for a little while, but when she said, I don't want to do it, then I stopped and dedicated myself instead of raising money for a charitable organization in New Jersey for children with cancer, and for brain tumor, which I did. We had Mike Strahan 20 years ago for a golf tournament, raising money for Duke University Brain Tumor Center. And then my daughter was a swimmer, so I took classes, and I passed the test to be an official, so USA swimming official. So I spent a lot of time with that. And then when the children went to college, that's when I started to look back at my life, and I decided to go to school myself and start to write.
Your story is one of so much resilience. How do you keep going? What inspires you to go against what everyone around you might be saying is the way to go? Like, how do you not fall to just falling in line?
Well, I just always believed that, there's nothing you cannot do if you really want to do it. And I was always also, I'm an optimist by nature. And I'm also willing to work hard. And I believe that if you really want something badly enough, excuse me, you can, just the hard work is what matters. I was a swimmer myself. And what I always remembered through my life, when I was a child, our coach always used to say, I don't care if you come last. I don't care if everyone has to wait 15 minutes till you finish your race, but you finish your race. You do not give up. And it really stayed with me. And for me, it was never a question of giving up. It just was never an option that I had to finish the race. And no matter what I studied, whether it was writing or modeling, acting, I had to do all that I was able to do until I felt that I've done everything in my power. And I reached that end wall, and I was done.
What advice do you have for anyone that is currently looking at starting over in a new country? I have never left the United States to build a life somewhere, and I find I I've worked with so many immigrant students, and when I was a high school teacher, I find it so incredible that you're able to go to a country where you don't speak a language and not only make a life for yourself, but make a big name for yourself as well. What advice do you have for people?
Just, don't be afraid and learn as much as you can. Keep your ears open, and don't ever believe when somebody said to you, you can't do something, because you can. And focus on what matters to you, and keep going. And if meanwhile you have to do a lot of stuff that you would never want to do, just do it. If, I was a waitress, I worked as a cashier, and believe me, math was never my strong subject. But it just happened to be a job that was going, and I did it. And so it's just never be afraid. And of course, learn as much as you can about your surroundings, about your people. It always helps if you can communicate. So for me, my mother always believed learning languages. We learned Russian because we had to, but believe it or not, it actually came useful to me. And you just never know. We spoke German. I had to learn to speak English. I had to learn to speak French when we lived in Monte Carlo. And I have retained all of them as well as English, because I obviously speak. And maybe it was just as well that my children complain, but for me, it was better that my husband didn't speak English. It didn't speak Slovak. So I had to speak English. But my children do complain that I did not speak to them in Slovak. So because they cannot understand it. But it's hard to teach your children a language when your husband doesn't understand it. I could not have a conversation with my children when my husband doesn't know what I'm talking about. So sometimes you have to weigh the odds. What is more important? And so I said, if you really want to learn, you can. And my younger son spent 6 weeks in Slovakia living with my brother. And he's actually pretty fluent in Slovak. And my oldest son also can speak a little Slovak. By the time my daughter came along, the Slovak got a little bit less and less spoken. And my brother and I started to speak English because people around us didn't speak Slovak. So unfortunately, I mean, if it's a language that a lot of people can speak, it's easier. But when it's a language that very few people speak, it's a little more hard.
Mm. What do you dream in? You speak so many languages. I'm always curious what people dream in.
English. I dream in English. And that's when I decided that I was ready to write because I dream in English and I think in English. And that, I think it made me realize that I'm ready to start writing English.
Mm. How
In
does
fact,
that? Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was actually realizing that I often, instead of when I write Slovak, like I was sending my book to friends in Slovakia, and I wanted to write a dedication in Slovak. And I find myself, to my surprise, that I was actually translating what I wanted to write to them in English into Slovak. And it was very awkward. So I was like trying to sing, and I put on a Slovak song so that I got myself into thinking in Slovak so I could form the sentences that were not, they were more coherently, and they were more coherent and they were more Slovak than translation.
Mm. How does one approach writing a book? I always love when I have authors on to share a little bit of their insights. How do you keep the creativity flowing? How do you approach these are the stories that I want to share?
Well, when I did my short essays when I started to write the essays, they were all drawing from they were all about periods of my life that happened. Like the first story is Freedom, is when I first came to England and what happened. And each essay dealt with something in my life. And I also have written a fiction which has not been published yet. But everyone will tell you that you write about what you know. And so it's a historical fiction. And then you start with reality, and suddenly, at least I can speak for myself, I start with reality, and then I start to take it, I'm thinking, and I take it to places, and I find myself, well, a minute, this didn't happen. And that's when I realized I was ready to write fiction, because I started to imagining, following a thoughts into, even it was based in a reality, but the actual characters, it was not true. It was, I was creating them. And that's when I knew I was going to write fiction. The
Mm.
other thing which taught me, I adopted a dog from Mississippi. And he was the most beautiful dog you ever want to see. And I started to think, why and how would somebody give up this fabulous dog? And so there was a reality. There was a dog, and there was a dog that came from shelter. But how his journey and why was he given up, then I started to create these stories in my head. And that's when I knew I should start writing.
Mm. I imagine that you were doing a lot of stories in your head when you were a kid, wanting to be a writer as well.
Oh, yes. I will tell you, one thing, I was never, ever bored, and I never needed, I was always happy to be alone. I needed to be amongst a lot of people. I write about this. I loved being with a lot of people. I used to go and sit on a Piccadilly in London because there was just so many people. Or now I will go and have a coffee in Times Square, because I want to be amongst a lot of people, but I like to be alone. I don't necessarily need company, because it allows me to think about to me, every person around me is a book. It's a story, and I wonder what might be going through them, and I start imagining, and that's my inspiration for my fictional writing. Just looking at people, and so even as a child, how I would entertain myself when I would walk long distances, because there were no buses, there were no, we used to have a bicycle, but even on a bicycle, I used to go, when we were swimming, I would go, it would be sometimes 2 kilometers. And so you go, and so when I bicycled, I would think in my head, I would make up a stories and I would take them every which way. I would take a grain of reality and I would see a house that is looking rather odd where it is. And I would start thinking, why is that house looking different than the other houses? And before I knew it, I made it into stories. And my mother used to say, are you telling me a tale? So my stories were always rather suspicious when I told my mother.
Storytelling is so important in preserving cultural and personal histories. How do you see that role showing up in your book, in your life?
Well, I think it is very important. And I do hope that a lot of people in America will learn about this tiny little country, what happened during the First World War and Second World War, and the resilience of the people who has been occupied really almost, it's without getting into a history, but really the beginning of the Slovak and Czech people started in the 7th century. And they were because it was in the heart of Europe, whether people went from north to south or east to west, they always went through this little town, this little area where people were resting. And it was it had a lot of beautiful mountains and it offered a lot of water and food and the weather was kind. And then the bigger nations claimed that land, and those people were pushed and were occupied. Slovakia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and for 1,000 years. My father, in one of the stories, which is also very dear to me, in fact, it was a story that got nominated for Pushcart Prize. It's a story about how my father, when he was a child, was punished because he spoke Slovak and he was supposed to speak Hungarian. And then he swore he will never speak Hungarian once Czechoslovakia became recognized after First World War. And then we missed each other at a Victoria train station. And he did not speak English, and he lost my phone number and my address. And then he suddenly, the only other language he could speak was Hungarian, but he hasn't spoken it since a childhood. And yet he was really rescued by a father and son who, the father came to visit the son, who obviously, just like my father, who was living in England, and how these two people help him, and how the language became very important to him. And he was surprised he still remembered, and how he learned that the kindness of people can transfer years of suffering. And it was a very, very, it's also another very powerful story. In fact, it's called Encounter with the Future, because it was how my father encountered the future and left his past behind. And I felt like I encountered the future in Ipswich when Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. So I thought it was appropriate name for the essay and for the book.
Mhm. I have a degree in history, and living in the United States, we don't really know a lot about history oftentimes. I know because I taught it and I'm aware of what books had and what we were sharing. And I primarily was focused on US history. But there is so much richness to understanding the resilience of your people. If you want to give us a tiny little bit more of that
Yeah,
history, I think Americans would love to hear that. Most people
yeah.
can't find you on a map.
Yes, and I hope that the book will shed a little bit in the stories. They will learn more about Europe and altogether the landscape of the heart of the Europe,
Yeah.
and what formed those people. In some of I'm a big fan of Arthur Miller, and story. And I like to go into details, which is not always appreciated unless you're a big name. So a lot of my essays, a lot of them have been cut down a lot because I tend to go into a history, and it's unfortunate, but you need to, in order for people to stay interested, you cannot get into too much of a nitty-gritty of the history, because if people really are interested in history, they'll find it. So, but the story has to flow. But I'm thrilled that you are so interested.
Yes. What are some common misconceptions about the immigrant experience that you hope to address?
Um, I became immigrant very long time ago, and it was a different experience than what it is now. And also, I was in London, and Europe was absolutely appalled about what was happening in Czechoslovakia, and the British people were very much supportive, and the government was supportive. They gave everybody a permanent visa and a work permit when Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. And I understand it's easier to do when it's a country of 5 million people. And but now I think that also it's very different because we can communicate across the globe. We can move. I remember when I was first going as a model to work to Frankfurt, I will tell you, there were a few times there was like 3 people on a plane. That does not happen anymore. So it changed vastly. So people travel, and you would think that that would help the people to understand deeper and quicker, but in some ways it doesn't, which is a pity.
Any unique struggle that you had in that experience?
Yes, of course I did. There were people, one of the essays deal with a person when I was working as a model who, always called me a commie because, as far as he was concerned, I didn't belong in England. Excuse me. And he made my life very difficult. But, it's the type of things that probably every immigrant goes through. Nobody will have a smooth experience 100%. But I believe those are challenges that are also important because it creates in us a sympathy and understanding of the other people, the new immigrants who come, and you realize that it's just misunderstanding, and how important it is to show kindness and to show direction. Sometimes it's not even kindness, it's just direction. Direct people in the right way. And it's because it can be very overwhelming when you have to learn so much. It's assault on your sensitivities, on your brain, on your heart. And it's very easy to lose a footing.
Any tips for fostering greater understanding and empathy for immigrants, particularly as the United States is experiencing an increase in them? Wow.
I really think that knowledge is very important. And so learning about other people, it's the most important thing. Learning, whether it is with book. Today, everything is at your fingertips, which is a good and bad, because not everything you find on internet or on a phone is necessarily true. And that is a challenge, I think, for today, because in the old days, we learned from books. We trusted BBC you would never question what was on a BBC. And there's fewer and fewer those institutions that you can be 100% sure that whatever they say is true. And that creates uncertainty and questions. And I just wish there was at least one single organization in the world that everyone could trust.
Mm.
It's unfortunately difficult thing to find.
Yeah, I think that's what communism was trying to do, was to create themselves as being the one organization you can trust. There's so
Right. I mean, yes. I mean, we didn't believe a single word that they were saying. And interestingly enough, we didn't even believe them when they were telling the truth. And so, it is very difficult to do. I mean, it's like what I really would. It's a unrealistic thought, but it would be if there would be some magic that will tell you the truth and you can rely on, not one organization that people think is true. It's got to be actual truth.
yeah. What
And
I
that's
hear
how,
in your story is that is also almost a separation of the immigrant from the country. I think a lot of the stories that get written about immigrants is that they are their country. And if people have preconceived notions or a different truth about their country, what I hear from you is that you weren't all a bunch of communists. In fact, many of you were resisting that. And yet you come to London and you get accused of being that.
right, exactly. Exactly. And, I'll be honest with you, not everybody who came out at the time was somebody I would be proud of, say, oh, he's from Slovakia or he's from Czechoslovakia. There were some people who were felt a little privileged, I have a story of a friend of acquaintance that, for example, when you come to a new country, you have to do what you have to do, whether it's washing dishes or whatever you need to do. And so he said to me, can you help me? So I found him a job in a restaurant. And in a restaurant, he was asked washing dishes. And he said to me, are you crazy? I'm an engineer. I have a degree in engineering. I'm not going to wash dishes. I said, well, then go back and be an engineer. So it's often also you have different types of people, and that people that are willing to work and do whatever they need to do and become what they set out to do. And then there are some people who don't. So it's a humanity. We are all different, and that's what it is. But I think that in the end, most of us have a right compass, and that's what is important. And I'm an optimist, so I believe all will be well in the end, because most of the people have a good heart and have a right compass and are working hard to achieve what they set out to achieve, and that just have a mutual respect to each other. I find that was always very important. If I gave people respect, they respected me. Not always, but they did.
Where can listeners learn more about your work and purchase the Encounter with the Future?
Well, they can go to my website, www.anikapavel.com, and there you can learn about my modeling career, my acting career, about where I came from, and you can also see some of the podcasts. And oh, I forgot to brag. My book has just been selected by New York Big Book uh, Review as the favorite autobiography.
Oh,
So that's a nice little award I just received.
absolutely. I can
And
see
it's all
you.
gonna be it's all
No,
on
that's
my web.
good. I can see your book being one of those autobiographies that or memoirs that kids read in school to learn more and to understand pieces of history that they might be missing out on.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there. Um, yes, a lot of history and um, a lot of love, I believe, and a lot of care, a lot of emotion.
And as we wrap up today, I have my 3 questions I ask all of our guests. What
Okay.
is your superpower?
Never give up.
Yes. And what is your purpose?
My purpose is to to leave behind a legacy that people can learn from.
Hmm. And what's next for you? I heard I heard that you're going to be writing some fictitious stories, but what's next? What can we expect to see?
Well, I have 2 projects going. It's a book called The Lone Sparrow, and it's a historical fiction. And then I have my 9 stories about my dog, Barney, who came from Mississippi. And it's about his journey and his love. And I'm a big animal lover. And so, it's that's for me. And of course, being a grandmother, I enjoy being grandmother and being with my children. I threaten to live to 100. So, so I have a long way to go still.
It's very inspiring to hear the never give up and to see your dream of becoming a writer come to fruition so much later in life, where oftentimes we give up on those childhood dreams. So I thank you
It's
so
never
much.
too late.
It is never too late. And I always give our guests the last word on the podcast, whatever you'd like to leave our audience with today.
Stay optimistic, work hard, and the reward will come.